Joining me now is Josh Gordon. He's with the Concord Coalition. Josh, first of all, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Let's first get this out of the way. We want to give people as much information about the organizations that we talk to regarding issues. So tell me, is the Concord Coalition, before we talk about tax reform, is it left-leaning, is it right-leaning, and what's the take overall on the proposed tax reform going through Congress right now?
Well, we're nonpartisan, and we have a bipartisan board. We were started by a former Democratic member of the Senate and a former Republican member of the Senate, Paul Tsongas and Warren Rudman, to educate the public about fiscal responsibility and the generationally important issues of our increasing debt and making sure that for future generations, we don't leave them with what currently is projected to be a large amount of debt.
The talking points, the way I see it right now coming out of Washington, is this will help the middle class, this won't help the middle class, this that we're being sold a bill of goods. If it does help the middle class, we're only talking about a couple $1,000s a year, which many pundits are saying is just not going to make a difference for the average American. Where does your organization stand on the information that's being presented about proposed legislation related to the budget and taxing?
Well, I mean, I think what people should do if they want to know the answers to those questions is look to the reports of the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation. Unfortunately, it looks like Senate Republicans are going to try and rush ahead with their vote before the full score from those organizations are in. But the scores that have been released definitely show that the tax cuts do favor corporations and the wealthy over the middle class in terms of the benefits that those groups would gain. And from our standpoint, what is kind of lost in all this is that when you add to the deficit, like they're going to do with this bill, by anywhere from $1.5 to $2.2 trillion over just the first 10 years, you're also leading to future tax increases and spending cuts that will fall on the middle class primarily. So I think that our debt concerns are kind of not being taken very seriously by Republicans right now, and that's really concerning.
Let's go back to empowering people, because I mean, you made a good point. We always hear about the CBO, and over these past few months and years, politicians have tried to say the CBO is just spinning things. I mean, that's just false, isn't it? I mean, it's a nonpartisan organization. It's been established for many, many years. The CBO score and all the information coming from them is really critical for us to understand what we're talking about, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it in your own life, right now I'm doing a home renovation, and I have a contractor, and I want that contractor to use a ruler to figure out where to put things and how much wood to cut. And if he told me that he had his own ruler that he kind of just made up, and he thinks it's a more accurate measurement, even though you can go to Home Depot and buy rulers that are kind of all the same length, I would much prefer he stick with that. And that's what Congress has in the form of the Congressional Budget Office. Their models are nonpartisan, widely accepted in the private sector as being as accurate or more accurate than any other models of the economy and models of tax changes. And for Congress to ignore those models that they themselves have paid for and set up over time to give them honest, nonpartisan analysis is very concerning. It's very frightening. It really just means that they're trying to pass something and they're not very concerned about what the consequences, either economic or from a federal budget standpoint, are.
So let's be clear, from the Concord Coalition's point of view, reviewing the data that you have, you're saying that yes, there might be a little bit of short-term benefit, but long-term, we're talking about some serious increases to the national deficit.
Yeah, I think it's very clear that the debt is going to go up substantially from this legislation. Tax cuts do not pay for themselves. There are no respected studies that have ever shown tax cuts to pay for themselves, and we should not be legislating on wishful thinking. We should be legislating with our best information. If it turns out that they don't cut taxes by enough, and the debt, under a normal situation, was not going to go up, they can always cut taxes later. But this right now is a situation where we know for the next 10 years we're going to add $10 trillion to our deficit. That's what the current projections are. And this would add another $1.5 to $2 trillion on top of that, even accounting for any economic growth benefits you might get from the change. So that's just what nonpartisan, respected analysts think. And ignoring that simply means you're trying to get to yes without hearing the best analysis you could possibly get.
Help us understand where things are at. You're saying that, are you saying Republicans and Democrats are trying to rush it? Congress in general? Are you saying Republicans are trying to rush this through both parts of Congress?
Republicans are trying to rush it. I think the Senate is going to vote, or they might start voting today, and it might take a couple days, and then they'll pass it. And then the House will have a choice whether to just take up the Senate bill and pass it, or whether they're going to meet with Senate leaders and House leaders to kind of hammer out what some of the major differences are between the legislation the House passed a few weeks ago and this Senate legislation. But there's no doubt it is going very quickly. In fact, a lot of the Senate legislation hasn't been released publicly. Senators don't even know what's in it, and yet they're about to vote either today or tomorrow.
Is there any way to reach out to your congressman at this point and say, hey, let's put the brakes on this?
Yeah, I think calling your senators is probably the most effective thing you could do right now. If you're upset and you have a Republican senator, pick what you're upset about and tell that senator. And even Democratic members should kind of understand where their constituents are on this. And there are ways to have tax reform be bipartisan, and there are many good plans out there to have bipartisan tax reform. Tax reform is actually essential, one of the essential building blocks for future economic growth. And there are good ways to do that and bad ways to do that. And the way they're doing it right now is not very good.
At what point, where do you think we go from here as far as if this does pass, making any changes? I mean, is that it for now?
Well, listen, Congress can always change tax law.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah.
But
it's a lot harder.
Sure. I mean, once you give tax cuts, it's hard to reverse those. And one of the reasons why we've always supported revenue neutral bipartisan tax reform is that it lays out the trade-offs in the legislation. And people are aware that you're broadening the tax base by getting rid of deductions. And then you're also lowering rates at the same time. So you can kind of have the carrot and the stick go together and make it a more fruitful kind of legislative journey. I don't think it's too late to do that kind of legislation. And I actually think there would be a lot of Democrats that would vote with Republicans for some piece of legislation that actually reformed the corporate tax code instead of making the tax code really more complicated is what they're doing instead of less complicated, in addition to the debt issues from having such a huge increase in the debt because of the loss of revenue.
Okay. So the Concord Coalition, I'd imagine it's just concordcoalition.org, is that right?
Yep.
Okay, concordcoalition.org. We're going to get some analysis a little bit more detailed than what we got into, and also the Congressional Budget Office. We can just Google that. I think it's cbo.gov, but best to Google that. And that's, like you said, that's kind of the main spot. Even though all the information isn't there, that's the way to inform yourself outside of the talking heads that we see everywhere right now.
Yeah, and there are also a couple of key publications, like the Wall Street Journal is kind of doing minute-by-minute reporting on this, and they actually have gotten their hands on some of the behind-the-scenes analysis from the CBO and the Joint Committee on Tax, and I think that's also very educational for people to read and understand the bill.
Well, what really stood out to me, and I've heard this before from numerous sources, that a lot of this stuff is being done in private. A lot of this legislation is being written in private. So even the senators who are voting on this don't really know what they're voting on. They're just voting on kind of the summer, if you will.
That's certainly the case at this point.
Very good. Josh Gordon, thank you for joining us. Hopefully you'll stay in touch with us as things develop here.
If you found this post informative, please like, comment on, and share it. This post was crowdfunded, so if you like what we're doing, please consider sponsoring one or more posts so we can make more. Sign up using the URL on the screen.